Hey everybody, this is Clint Lanier, Professor of Rhetoric and Professional Communication, and today we're going to talk about using PRIOS. That sounds pretty fun, doesn't it? So first of all, what is PRIOS? When should it be used? And then what are some examples of each category? We're going to go through all this stuff today and hopefully give you a better sense of some of the methods that we use for pre-writing or invention before you actually start writing any documents, okay? And for those who are taking a course from me, especially my accounting class, this is what I use when I am grading papers. So this is kind of the criteria that I use when I am grading them, okay? So definitely pay attention and definitely try to use these as much as you possibly can. So starting out, what is PRIOS? Well, PRIOS is an acronym to help remember what you need to think about for communication. It's a method of pre-writing or invention to use before you create a communication, and it's used before you create the communication to understand what is it that you are going to say, what needs to be said, and also how best to say it. Okay? So understand this. Before you begin writing anything, in the workplace anyway, professionally, you've got to understand who your audience is and what you need to say to that audience. Now, PRIOS is a method that helps you figure out what it is you need to say to your audience and how you should say it. It gives you all the things that you need to think about before you start writing. It's a lot of stuff, and I understand that. A lot of people really don't like to do that, don't like to go through this exercise because there's quite a bit of it, as you'll see, but it's important. You know, you want your communication in the workplace to be successful. I've said it many times before in my classes, and I'll say it again. Success in the workplace really has little to do with your skill as, you know, within your discipline. Okay? Instead, it's how effective and how efficient and how successful your communication is more than anything else. I've seen brilliant engineers who got nowhere in their careers because they couldn't talk to other people and they couldn't write very well. That's simply the truth. So when entering the workplace, when designing communications, whether it be for a client or for a supervisor or a colleague, excuse me, it's important to think about these things before you start writing, okay? And it will help you create more effective and successful communications. So that's what PRIOS is supposed to do. PRIOS stands for purpose, readers, information, organization, and style. So before you begin writing a communication, you want to go through this list, and I'll go through them all with you in a moment, and think about the purpose, readers, information, organization, and style. And then once you've thought of it, you write your communication with those things in mind. So you write your letter, your email, whatever it happens to be, with these things in mind. Now, before I begin, let me say this. This doesn't mean that you need to take a sheet of paper and write each of these on it. At the very least, all you have to do is think through them. Okay, mentally go through this list and then design your communication. That's all I want you to do. Doing that will create a much more successful communication for you in the long run. Okay, so starting out with purpose, a couple of things to ask yourself. How well does the document achieve its planned outcomes? And how well does the document provide new knowledge and understanding for the reader? So, a couple of things you need to have here before you can answer these questions. What are the planned outcomes for this document? Everything written, every communication in the workplace has a purpose. This is what really separates professional communication, the type of communication we do on the job, with other types of communication. So, for example, creative writing, it might lack any noticeable purpose, but we do things in the workplace for a purpose. In other words, we write a proposal because we want to get something. We generate a report because we want to have some type of outcome after we generate that report. So everything we write, every presentation we make, whatever, it's going to have some type of planned outcome. How well is your document going to achieve that? The next thing to ask is, how well does the document provide new knowledge and understanding for a reader? Now, every type of document, if it's going to have a purpose, it's going to provide some type of new knowledge or understanding for the reader. Otherwise, you wouldn't be designing the communication in the first place. For example, you might be writing an email to your supervisor to alert them to something. Maybe it was a problem in the workplace, or maybe it was a success in the workplace. But how much do they already know about it? If they don't know anything about it, then you're going to have to provide that new knowledge and understanding to them. Okay. Next thing to ask is, how effectively does the document address the reader's cognitive, social, and emotional needs? You probably didn't realize that readers have cognitive, social, and emotional needs, did you? A lot of people don't. And a lot of students ask me, what's the difference between these three? Well, let's start with cognitive. Cognitive comes from cognitive psychology, and it's really the information that a reader needs in order to make a decision. Okay? So if you are trying to get your reader to decide which piece of office furniture to buy for your office, well, you'll need to give them the information that they'll need in order to make that decision. What information would they need in order to make a decision about which of two pieces of furniture they should get for the workplace? Well, they'll probably need to know the price, maybe where it's made, maybe if there's a warranty on it, and so forth. All these things will then be used by the reader to make a decision. Now, what are the social needs of a reader? Well, those are the things that affect the reader's relationship to others around him or her. So, for example, coworkers. Let's say you send an email to your supervisor about a dispute you're having with a coworker. Well, the social need of your supervisor is the supervisor does not want both you and your coworker hating him or her or each other. Those are social needs because that's a social need. We don't want any problems at the workplace. So how would you then compensate for that? Now, what about emotional needs? Do readers have emotional needs, and should we care about them? Absolutely, yes, they do. For example, if you are an accountant and you're dealing with money, that's about the most emotional subject you can possibly think of, other than perhaps some type of relationship. So if you are communicating with a client about an audit, for example, maybe they're being audited, can you understand how emotional that might make them? They'll be feeling nervous, they might be feeling scared, and so on and so forth. So these are things that you have to understand. How effectively is your document going to address those emotional needs of them getting an audit? What is it you should write in order to address those needs? Perhaps you could tell them, in this example, that there's no need to worry, that the worst that's going to happen is they might have to pay a small fine, or they might have to pay some back taxes or something. It's not like they're going to go to jail or anything like that. So they need reassurance because of these emotional needs. Okay, so these are three things to definitely think about for your reader. Another thing is to think about the writer's role and stance in relation to the reader. What is your role as you're writing this communication? Writers take on a lot of different roles when it comes to professional communication. For example, they could be an advisor to the reader, telling the reader basically which course of action they should take. You could be an advocate for the reader. In other words, you're trying to help the reader somehow, help them solve a problem. You could be a lot of different things. So what is your role? Figuring out your role, what it is you're trying to help the reader do, or what you're doing for the reader, will help you understand how you're going to address them. It'll help you understand what information you're going to include, and so forth. Now, how sensitive is the document to the to the reading circumstances? So how, when, and where it is read. What does this mean? Well, going back to the example of an accountant, if you write to a client, for example, on January 10th and say, "Dear client, I need to get all of your records, perhaps your spending records for the past year, and I need all that documentation as soon as possible." Okay, and you send that on January 10th or something like that. Well, that might not mean very much compared to if you were to send it April 13th, because taxes are due in 4 days, and you say, "Dear reader, I need this stuff now." Okay, so there are different, depending on the reading circumstances of when that particular document gets written, it will have an effect on how it's read. Okay. Something else to consider is perhaps where it's read. Physically, where is it read? Have you ever noticed that you put a book down in front of your computer and you try to type a line from that book and your book keeps closing? Well, they make books with kind of like spindle binders on them so that you can open them and it lays flat on a desk and you can directly copy out of them. And those are made to be used on a desk because the people that create books like that, or the people that are creating those types of documents, understand that that's how it's going to be used. So that's something else to consider. Another quick item about how it is read. Think of those big billboards that you might see at a swimming pool that show you how to do CPR. Notice those are big, huge boards that are bolted up to the side of the wall next to a swimming pool. The people who created those things understand the reading circumstances, that somebody's not going to have time to run over and get a manual on how to do CPR. They're going to have to do it from maybe across the swimming pool. So they'll need to have this very big, visible set of directions in order to advise them how to do it. Okay, so think about those types of things too. How is this document going to be read? When is it going to be read? Where is it going to be read? And what are the things that you have to do when you consider those things? What are the things that you have to do to make sure that your document is sensitive to all of these things? Okay. The next thing is information. How effectively does the information address the reader's concerns, questions, and problems? Now, in order to figure this out, what three things do you have to figure out? You have to figure out what the reader's concerns, questions, and problems actually are, right? Well, those obviously are extremely important, and that's in a different lecture we talk about audience analysis. That's trying to figure out what it is, who you're writing to, and what are their characteristics and so forth. Figuring that stuff out will help you understand what questions they might have, what problems they might have, and what concerns they might have, okay? Now, you need to figure all these things out ahead of time, especially the questions. What questions are the readers going to have? If you can figure that out, then you could include answers to those questions right in the document. So as they're asking them, then you can answer those questions. Let me answer those questions. Let me give you an example. If you were to be, let's say I was terminated from my job, one question, and I received a letter that told me so. Obviously, one question I'm going to have is, why was I terminated? So the person writing that letter would have to obviously understand I'm going to want to know what the reason was, and so they're going to have to include some type of rationale for the decision that was made. I don't know why I thought of that example. Hopefully that didn't happen anytime soon. But in any case, I hope that you'll understand that understanding the reader's questions is going to be very, very, very important. Now, next is how well balanced is the technical versus the lay information for the audience? Well, to understand this, you have to know who your audience is and what they already know. Let's say you're an engineer and you're writing to another engineer. Well, can you use technical information when you're writing to that other engineer? Can you use what we call lay information or jargon? Not lay information, rather, but jargon, information that's used within the industry? In that case, yes, you probably can. But let's say you're an engineer and you're writing to an accountant. Well, in a case like that, you will obviously have to define any technical terms that you use. You will have to provide examples and really ensure that you describe the technical information well enough so that the reader, the accountant in this example, understands what it is you're telling them. Likewise, let's say you're an accountant and you're writing to a client. If that's the case, how much technical information should you include? What types of jargon should you include? For example, will a client automatically know what the term deductible is? I don't know. You'll have to figure out how much information that client already knows, and let's say they don't. Then you could define deductible or whatever it happens to be, so that the client understands what it is you're talking about. Okay. The next question to ask yourself is, how credible and ethical is that information? Now, there's two very, very important points here: credibility, and ethics. Now, credibility, I have a different presentation called Persuasion in Writing, and I hope you you have watched that. And I talk about ethos and building credibility. But how do you build credibility in your information? Well, you do that by sourcing the information, telling us where you get it from. That immediately creates credibility for that information. So if you are quoting something or if you are stating something very specific, give us a source for that information. Where can I go and find out more information about it? And that's one reason to do it. The other reason to do it is simply so that I know that you did your homework, so that I can trust you when you're telling me this, when you're giving me this information. It's not an opinion, and it's not coming from your, just something that you made up. You're actually getting this from somewhere. So you've done research in it, and it can be verified. Okay. Now the second part of this is ethics. How ethical is that information? Well, it's probably it depends. Again, when we speak of ethics in information, we're not necessarily talking about lying. Okay, that's something obviously that if you were to do that, that would make it unethical. We're not talking about, say, fudging numbers on a graph or a chart or anything like that. What we're talking about in this case is we're ensuring that the information is understood. So how understandable is that information for the particular reader? Okay, what does that mean? So if let's say that you are, and I'm going to go back to my example of an accountant. Let's say you're an accountant and you are writing to a client, and this client happens to be a farmer and knows nothing about accounting. And you're writing a document to try to tell the client that they need to do X, Y, or Z for their tax preparation. If you don't define any terms, if all you use is accounting jargon, there's little chance that your reader will understand what it is you're talking about. Okay? That is, I would argue, that is unethical to do. Okay? To make that information ethical, you need to explain it to your reader. Obviously ask, what is it they know? What is it they don't know? Okay, what is it that I have to very give them examples of? Define, perhaps. What are these things that I have to ensure that they really, truly understand? If you don't do that, then the information is considered unethical. You might have seen, for example, or you might have seen examples where, let's say, an attorney or a doctor or somebody like that uses very, very big, elaborate words that are perhaps used in their own industry and nowhere else. And the person they're speaking to has no idea what it is they're talking about, but the big words are used to kind of beat them into submission by demonstrating how smart the speaker or the writer is. Well, that's unethical. It's unethical to do that. So you need to ensure that the information that you're sharing is completely ethical. How do you do that? You do that by providing examples of something. You do that by providing definitions of whatever it happens to be, in order to ensure that your audience completely understands the information. Okay? Moving on to organization. So how well is the information organized for the readers? Again, you need to understand that organization, something as small as organization, can play a huge role in how successful a document is. Okay? Have you ever read a document that just kind of seems to go all over the place? In other words, they have a point in the first paragraph, but not in the second one, and then the third paragraph is talking about something completely different, and then the fourth paragraph maybe goes back to the point that they made in the first paragraph. That's unorganized information, and it's difficult to read documents like that. They just make no sense. So you need to ensure that you've laid out the structure or the organization for the document as well as you can, so that it provides a logical kind of sequence of information. This is especially true for, say, an argument. And there's another presentation I have on the 5-paragraph essay. The nice thing about that 5-paragraph essay is it has a very detailed and specific organization for the reader. And a lot of documents will have a very specific organization depending on the type of document or genre it is. Also, how effective is the page design? Little things like ensuring that a title uses all caps, or that a section title uses all caps, that there are page numbers, that you are using a single line spacing and double lines between paragraphs. Things like that lends to the page design, and that simply makes information easy to find, and once it's found, it makes the information easy to read and easy to understand. Okay, so page design is a huge benefit to readers. Good page design is a huge benefit to readers, and it also lends to the organization of the document. Okay, there are a number of cues that you can include to ensure that a document is well organized and that the page design is successful. Look at my other lecture under document design for a lot of tips on how that's actually done. Okay. Next, how effectively does a document draw on conventional genres? This is so important. A genre indicates some type or group of documents that all kind of have the same structure. For example, memos are a genre of documents. All right. We know what a memo is supposed to look like. Have you ever seen a memo? It says memo typically in the top in the center, and it has a very detailed kind of organization. A newspaper is a type of genre. We know what a newspaper looks like. We know where to go in that newspaper to find information. And that's the key right there, is if it is a specific type of genre, if it is a specific genre, and you adhere to that genre, well, you're helping the audience, because the audience says, oh, this is a memo. I know what to expect from a memo, and I know where to find information. However, if you give them something that looks like a memo, but instead it's written like a letter, which has a different organization, then the reader is going to be a little bit confused. They were expecting this type of document, and it looks like that type of document, but you gave me the organization for this type of document, and that doesn't make any sense. So one of the things that you need to do is try to figure out, well, what genre should I use when I send this? Should I use a memo? Should I use a letter? Should this be a report? What should it look like? Now, once you figure out what that genre is, that will best and most effectively communicate what it is you're trying to communicate, then you need to figure out, okay, what should it look like? Okay, if this is the genre, what should the structure of that genre be? And once you figure out what genre you should use, then it's fairly easy. There are tons of resources in your books, online. What is the structure of a memo, or what is the structure of a letter, or report, or whatever. Okay, so figure out what genre you should use, and then stick to the structure of that genre. That will help you organize the information. Moving on to style. So how effective is the author's voice and style for this writing situation? Every document has what we call a voice. In other words, it has a tone or a sound. Okay, is it authoritative? Is it pleading? What is the tone for this, or the voice and style for the writing situation, or for this document? And is it appropriate to that writing situation? For example, if you're reprimanding, say, your own employees or something like that, well, then the voice should probably not be pleading. It should probably be more authoritative or strict, perhaps. But if you are asking somebody for a favor or something, perhaps it should be more of a pleading tone or a pleading voice. So figuring out what the writing situation is and ensuring that the voice and style for that is appropriate for that writing situation is extremely important. Next, how appropriate is word choice? Okay, what should the word choice be? Is it professional? Is it casual? Here's a mistake that I always see students making. They're always using contractions in professional documents. So can't, won't, don't, didn't, isn't. Those are very casual. That's a casual way of writing. So when you write professional documents within the workplace, you'll want to make sure that something as small as that, like those small contractions, are spelled out. Do not, is not, cannot, will not, so on and so forth. Ensure that the word choice is appropriate for the type of document, for the purpose of the document, for the readers of the document, and so forth. And that goes for making sure that technical language is defined. Okay? And lastly, how well does the document follow standards of grammar, mechanics, and usage? This is just basic. You need to ensure that there are no grammatical errors within your document, there are no misspellings within your document. Go over those types of things with a fine-tooth comb. Make sure that all those surface level errors, as I like to call them, are taken out. Those things will doom a paper, will doom any type of communication before you even begin. The number one reason, according to various surveys, the number one reason a lot of resumes get rejected is because of grammatical and misspelling errors. So ensure that whatever document you create is free of all of those things. How can you do that? The best way to do that is to take the document and read it out loud to yourself. You will find mistakes, so many mistakes, very quickly if you read that document out loud. Now, even after you do that, I would then give it to somebody else and say, could you read this for me? Can you tell me if there are any mistakes in it? Can you help me find any mistakes? Ask them to read it out loud. It's amazing what happens when you start reading documents out loud. You immediately begin to find all these little mistakes that you had never seen before. Okay, so do those things. Read it out loud to yourself. Have somebody else read it out loud before you ever get around to submitting that communication, just to make sure that you don't have any problems with grammar and so forth. Okay. So when should PRIOS be used? Simply put, every time you have an important professional communication to design. Every single time. Okay? And as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, this doesn't mean that you have to actually write out a list of all of these things. Sometimes you might want to. If it's a very important or very big project, it would probably be a good idea to document PRIOS as much as you can so that you get ideas for it. But even when designing an email to send to a supervisor or to a client or to a coworker, at the very least, run through this checklist mentally. Go through with purpose and reader and information organization and style. Ensure that you've answered all of these questions and that you've done your best to account for all of these things before you ever send it out. Now, how do you apply it? Simply, all I want you to do is take those lists of questions I gave you and turn them into statements instead. Or different questions about them. So purpose. What are the outcomes you and the reader want to achieve with this document? And list them all. This is something that oftentimes students aren't familiar with. That you and the reader can have two different purposes for something. Okay? If I create a resume and cover letter to send to a company, the purpose I have is to try to get an interview with them. The purpose they have is to try to find the best candidate. So we each have a different purpose, and this will happen often. You might send an incident report to your supervisor, and your purpose is to make sure the supervisor knows that this thing was not your fault. The supervisor's purpose is to find out whose fault it is and find out maybe what happened and what needs to be done, right? So figure out what the purpose is, and the next question to ask are, what are the outcomes that you and the reader want to achieve with this document? What is this document supposed to do? List every single one of them, okay? Moving on, what new knowledge and understanding will you provide to the reader? In other words, what do they have to know in order to meet that purpose? Next, the reader or rhetorical situation, as I like to call it. What are the reader's cognitive, social, and emotional needs? List absolutely all of them and think about what they might be. The cognitive needs are fairly easy to understand. In other words, what do they need to know in order to make a decision about whatever it is? But what are the social needs? So who around them might be affected by this information, and how do you address that? Let me give you an example. I like to use the example of accountants all the time because, again, money is such an emotional subject. I mentioned audit earlier. So let's say you have a client. Let's say you're an accountant and you have a client who is being audited. What are their cognitive, social, emotional needs? Cognitive needs is maybe what do they need to do in order to ensure that the audit runs smoothly? Okay. What information do they need to gather? What documents do they need to gather? And so forth. Okay. Next, their social needs. What do you think their social needs might be? Well, being audited might be embarrassing to some people. What if they are a small business? It might look bad if they are audited. In this last presidential election, it was brought up that President Trump was being audited at the time, and that happens in business sometimes. So maybe they don't want that information to get out. So in this case, you would reassure them that don't worry, nobody is going to know about this but us and you. And then finally, their emotional needs. They might be scared, they might be angry. So what do you do to address that? In the document, you would say there's no need to worry, there's no need to panic, everything's going to be fine. The worst that can happen is, again, a fine, or maybe you'll have to pay a little bit more money or whatever, but it's not a big deal. You're not going to go to jail and so forth, okay? So what are the reader's cognitive, social, emotional needs? Really think through that one and try to figure those out. Next, what should the writer's role and stance be in relation to the reader? So what is your role in relation to the reader? Again, are you coming from a voice of authority? Are you trying to get them to do something? So you should be pleading about something. Are you advocating for them? Are you advising them? What is your role going to be? And then what should your voice and tone be? Next, what reading circumstances should the document be sensitive to? How, when, and where it is going to be read. So what's going on right now? Okay, what's going on at the time? When is it going to be read? If it's going to be read in 2 weeks, what's going to be going on in 2 weeks, right? And where is it going to be read, and how will that make a difference? Let me give you a couple of examples here. So let's talk about when, right? When I worked for the Army Research Laboratory at White Sands Missile Range, and we were creating reports based on reports for weapon systems and so forth that the U.S. military had. We would run tests on them and see if they would break and so forth. Okay, so we were doing that, and that's just kind of the part of everyday life in that type of laboratory. But then when we invaded Iraq in, 2003, I guess, suddenly that information became a lot more important, because now we weren't using that information for training purposes. People were using that information within a war. So during warfare, what happens when this thing breaks, when this piece of equipment breaks on a soldier in the middle of the field? They're going to need to know how to fix it or what to do to avoid it breaking. So suddenly that information became a lot more important based on when it was read or when it was written. Okay. And as far as where it should be read, so there could be the physical properties for something. As I mentioned, the book that lays flat on the desk. Here's another example. My brother was in the Marine Corps for a short while, and I remember that their field manual for the United States Marine Corps was basically all the pages were plasticized. So like the entire book was plastic. Why do you think that is? Think about it for a moment and think about where it would be read. It's not going to be read in the nice kind of warm, dry environment of an office. It's going to be read out in the field, in the mud and in the rain and so forth, and this thing needs to hold up through all that. So understanding the physical circumstances, where this thing or how this thing is going to be read, what's going to be going on when it's being read is extremely important, and it's something that the document needs to be sensitive to. Next, information or creativity. So what concerns, questions, and problems will the reader have? Try to think of absolutely all of them. What are all the questions they're going to have? Oftentimes, when you put information down, that's going to raise more questions. So think about that. Questions on top of questions, or that follow information that you give, right? What technical information will be used, and should it be explained to the reader? So understanding who the reader is so important right here. How much information they already know about it, what their technical expertise might be, what their background might be. Figure that out, and that'll help you determine whether technical information should be used, and if it needs to be used, because technical information might still need to be used. If it needs to be used, should it be explained, or rather, how should it be explained? And then, how will you make the information credible and ethical? Where will you go? What is the best way to make this information credible? It could be sources, but it could be a picture. It could be maybe providing an example. It could be by talking about how this has happened before, called precedents. Think about how you're going to make that information as credible as possible. It could be something as simple as writing a letter on your business, your letterhead, okay, with your business's name on it. That might make the information credible. And how are you going to make it ethical? Okay, that will be determined by how much your readers already know about the subject or about the information, and it's going to be determined by ensuring that you've explained this information to them adequately. All right. Next, moving on to organization. What conventional genre should be used or must be used for this document? Genres all have a different purpose. Memos are written a certain way and are only used in certain circumstances. Business letters, on the other hand, might be written for a different circumstance. So what is the circumstance that you're responding to or that you're writing this for, and what type of genre best fits that circumstance? If you're not sure, simply do a keyword search. When do I use a memo? When do I use a business letter? When should I write a report? and it'll help you determine what's best to use. And then how will you organize that document or information? Oftentimes that's determined by the genre that you use. So if you have a memo, for example, memos are very short, very succinct. They don't have a long introduction. They don't provide a lot of background information. They merely go into answering a question or discussing something. Okay, so that's how you would organize, for example, a memo. So figure out what the genre is and what the conventional structure or organization of that genre is, and then apply it. Okay. Next, what elements of page design will you use? What is the best way to design this document, page by page, so that readers can easily access the information, can easily find information and understand and use that information? It could be everything from making sure that you're using lists like bulleted lists, or using images, or using page numbers, or subheadings and headings. Those types of things add to the usability of a document, so it helps readers find information and use it. And lastly, what is your voice or style for the document, and what type of language will be used? Professional, casual, lighthearted? Figure that out, and then obviously apply it. Okay. Now let's talk about a brief example. I'm going to use an example of an accountant who has a client, and you need the client to send you their vehicle mileage log, and so you decide to send them an email in order to get them to do this. So what is the purpose of this email? Well, the purpose is to ensure that you have their vehicle mileage log, and to make sure that the mileage you put down, say on their return, is accurate in every way. Okay, that is your purpose. So, what type of new information, new knowledge, or understanding will you provide for the reader in order to accomplish this? You might need to let them know that the IRS requires that all vehicles have some type of mileage log so that it is accurately reported. Maybe they don't know that. That'll be new understanding and new information for them. Moving on to the reader, what is their cognitive, social, emotional needs? Their cognitive need is simply, it could be, why do you need this vehicle mileage log? A social need could be, do you need to talk to anybody else about this mileage log? Will anybody else see the mileage log? Perhaps they don't want to. And their emotional need might be, maybe what happens if their mileage log doesn't meet what they reported to you, say the mileage. Perhaps in that case you could reassure them, don't worry if it's off by a few miles, it won't matter that much. Okay. What type of how sensitive will it be to the reading circumstances? How, when, where it is read? Well, it depends on when this is sent. If you send this to a client, if you're sending this to a client again in January versus April, that means that's a whole lot. Or versus maybe after filing, that means a whole lot. So that's something to consider. How about information? How credible and ethical will you make this? You could, for example, cite the IRS or IRC, which is the Internal Revenue Code, that says that vehicles have to have some type of mileage log that says. So you could cite that to make it credible. And as far as ethical goes, you would simply explain to them what that code means. Okay, what the quote, if you do quote the code, what that's actually saying. Moving on to organization, what type of genre should be used? It's an email, which is essentially like a memo. So you're going to structure it that way, saying very point blank, this is what we need, this is why we need it, and the why would be making it credible and ethical, and then merely concluding it. What types of page design? Again, it's a memo, so it's very short, very, very to the point, concise and accurate. As far as style goes, it's merely a voice of an advisor or perhaps an advocate, because you might be their CPA who's trying to help them complete their taxes. Okay. Now that was very quick, and I didn't touch on all of them, but I touched on the important things. Okay. Again, what I want you to do is at the very least make a mental note of these as you work down and as you decide to create a document, or when you decide to create a document, work through this list, work through PRIOS, purpose, reader, information, organization, and style, in order to better understand what it is you're supposed to write, how you're supposed to write it. Okay? Please let me know if you have any questions. Leave them down below in the comments section. If you're a student of mine and you have any questions, feel free and send me an email. Thank you.